For the Japanese defenders of Iwo Jima, the battle did not begin on February 19, 1945, when American Marines stormed the beaches. It began months earlier, with the understanding that this small volcanic island was not meant to be saved, but to be endured. Iwo Jima was strategically vital to Japan's last defensive perimeter. Located halfway between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland, it served as an early warning station for incoming American bombers and a potential emergency landing site for damaged aircraft. Losing it would expose Japan directly to sustained bombing. Holding it, even briefly, could buy time. That knowledge shaped every decision made by the Japanese garrison long before the first shell fell. Command of the island was entrusted to Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a general whose approach differed sharply from earlier Japanese defensive doctrine. Kuribayashi understood that traditional beach defenses and suicidal counterattacks would only lead to rapid annihilation under American naval and air firepower. Instead, he prepared for a battle of attrition fought underground. Over months, Japanese engineers and soldiers carved an extensive network of tunnels, bunkers, and firing positions into the volcanic rock. These tunnels connected strong points across the island, allowing troops to move unseen, reinforce threatened sectors, and survive bombardment that would have obliterated surface defenses. For the men tasked with digging and inhabiting these tunnels, life became a test of endurance long before combat began. Conditions were brutal. The volcanic ash made construction exhausting and unstable. Ventilation was poor. Water was scarce. Food was rationed tightly. Many soldiers suffered from illness, malnutrition, and exhaustion even before the invasion. Yet discipline remained firm. Kuribayashi made it clear that no one was expected to survive. There would be no evacuation, no retreat, and no surrender. The purpose of the defense was to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible and delay the American advance at any cost. For the Japanese troops on Iwo Jima, this was not framed as a battle to win, but as a duty to fulfill. As American air raids intensified in late 1944 and early 1945, Japanese soldiers learned what awaited them. The island was subjected to one of the heaviest pre-invasion bombardments of the Pacific War. Day after day, bombs and naval shells pounded the surface, tearing apart buildings and turning the landscape into a wasteland of craters and shattered rock. Underground, the defenders endured constant shock waves, collapsing tunnels, and suffocating dust. Many were buried alive during this phase, never seeing an enemy soldier. Those who survived emerged disoriented, deafened, and already hardened by weeks of relentless punishment. Psychologically, the bombardment served a grim purpose. It reinforced the belief that the enemy's power was overwhelming, and that survival depended entirely on discipline and concealment. Japanese soldiers were ordered not to respond to the initial landings. They would not defend the beaches. They would wait. This instruction went against instinct and training, but it reflected Kuribayashi's understanding of American tactics. By allowing the enemy to land and advance inland, the defenders could engage them at close range, where naval guns and air support were less effective. Every Japanese position was chosen with this in mind. Fields of fire overlapped. Kill zones were planned meticulously. Ammunition was conserved for moments that mattered. For the men in the tunnels, time moved slowly. They listened to the bombardment above them, knowing that when it stopped, the real battle would begin. They wrote letters that would never be sent. They prepared weapons and waited in darkness. Many believed they would never see daylight again. Yet morale, shaped by duty and resignation rather than hope, remained intact. This was the reality of Iwo Jima for Japanese forces before a single American Marine reached the shore. An island transformed into a grave, defended by men who had already accepted their fate. This mindset defined everything that followed. When the invasion finally came, it would not be met with dramatic charges or visible resistance. Instead, it would be answered with silence, patience, and sudden violence from below the ground. The Japanese experience of Iwo Jima was not one of glory or victory, but of endurance under impossible conditions. and it began not with gunfire, but with the quiet certainty that none of them were going home. When the American invasion fleet finally appeared off Iwo Jima on the morning of February 19th, 1945, Japanese soldiers remained underground. From their positions beneath the volcanic surface, they could hear the thunder of naval guns and feel the ground shudder as shells tore into the island. Yet they did not respond. This silence was deliberate. Unlike earlier Pacific battles, there would be no desperate attempt to repel the landing at the shoreline. The defenders had been ordered to wait to let the enemy come ashore unopposed and to draw them into carefully prepared killing zones further inland. For many Japanese soldiers, suppressing the instinct to fire was one of the hardest orders they would ever follow. As American Marines landed and advanced across the beaches, confusion spread among the attackers. The lack of immediate resistance created a false sense of security. From the Japanese perspective, this was precisely the goal. The defenders observed from hidden firing slits, periscopes, and tunnel openings, counting enemy numbers and noting movement patterns. They waited until the beach was crowded with men, vehicles, and supplies. Only then did the order come to open fire. When it did, the island erupted. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery concealed within the terrain unleashed sudden, devastating fire. To Japanese soldiers, this moment confirmed the months of preparation. The enemy was no longer an abstract force in the sky or at sea. He was directly in front of them, vulnerable and exposed. For the Japanese infantrymen, combat began at extremely close range. The tunnels allowed defenders to appear unexpectedly, fire, and then disappear again. Positions thought destroyed by bombardment suddenly came alive. American advances stalled almost immediately as units were pinned down by fire from multiple directions. From underground, Japanese troops moved laterally beneath the battlefield, reinforcing threatened sectors without exposing themselves to air or naval attack. This mobility gave them a sense of control, even as the enemy's material superiority remained overwhelming. Each successful ambush reinforced the belief that careful preparation could offset the imbalance in numbers and firepower. Yet this phase of the battle was also brutally costly for the defenders. Ammunition expenditure was tightly controlled, and every engagement had to justify the rounds used. Casualties mounted quickly as American forces adapted, calling in artillery and flamethrowers to neutralize suspected positions. The tunnels that provided protection also became traps when entrances were sealed or collapsed. Smoke, heat, and lack of ventilation turned underground positions into suffocating chambers. Many Japanese soldiers died without ever seeing an American face, overcome by fire or buried alive as the surface battle raged above them. Psychologically, the battle took an immense toll. Japanese doctrine emphasized endurance and sacrifice, but the reality of Iwo Jima tested these ideals to their limits. Days passed without sleep. Water became scarcer. Wounded soldiers were often left untreated as medical evacuation was impossible. Communication between units grew fragmented as tunnel sections were destroyed. Yet surrender remained unthinkable. Orders were explicit. Capture would bring dishonor, and survival beyond the battle was never part of the plan. For many defenders, the purpose of continued resistance was not victory, but obligation. As the days progressed, Japanese soldiers observed the enemy's determination firsthand. American forces did not withdraw. Losses did not break their advance. Instead, they adapted methodically, reducing positions one by one. From within the tunnels, Japanese defenders came to understand that their role was changing. The initial shock had been delivered. The enemy had been bloodied. Now the battle was becoming a prolonged struggle of attrition, fought meter by meter. Each position held delayed the inevitable, but could not prevent it. For the Japanese soldier, this realization was sobering. The defense of Iwo Jima had been designed to maximize enemy casualties, not to preserve the garrison. As the surface above them filled with craters and wreckage, the defenders continued to fight in isolation, often unaware of the broader situation. What mattered was the immediate struggle, holding a tunnel junction, defending a firing slit, or launching a brief counterattack before retreating underground again. The island became a maze of darkness, noise, and exhaustion. By the end of the first days of fighting, it was clear to the Japanese defenders that Iwo Jima would not fall quickly. Their preparations had succeeded in one critical respect. The enemy was forced into a grinding, costly battle with no clear end in sight. But it was also clear that survival would come only in moments, not in outcomes. The battle had entered its most brutal phase, one in which endurance would matter more than numbers, and resolve would be tested until nothing remained. As the battle dragged on, the true battlefield of Iwo Jima revealed itself beneath the surface. For Japanese soldiers, the tunnels were no longer merely defensive works. They became living spaces, command posts, hospitals, and graves all at once. Days blurred into nights in complete darkness, broken only by the vibrations of explosions and the distant echo of gunfire above. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the smell of sweat and decay. Ventilation systems were primitive, and as American forces sealed entrances with explosives and fire, oxygen became scarce. Soldiers fought not only the enemy but suffocation, dehydration, and exhaustion. Life underground followed a grim routine. Units rotated through firing positions when possible, but movement was dangerous and often impossible once tunnels collapsed. Wounded men lay where they fell, as evacuation was rarely feasible. Medical supplies were minimal and painkillers quickly ran out. Many soldiers died slowly from untreated injuries or infections, their comrades powerless to help. Food rations shrank steadily, reduced to handfuls of rice or biscuits consumed in silence. Water was rationed by the mouthful. Discipline held, but morale shifted from determination to resignation. Survival was measured in hours, not days. American adaptation made the tunnels increasingly dangerous. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, and grenades were systematically employed to neutralize underground positions. For Japanese soldiers, flamethrowers inspired particular dread. Fire consumed oxygen instantly, turning tunnels into ovens. Even soldiers not directly hit were burned or suffocated as flames raced through confined spaces. Some defenders chose to remain in sealed sections rather than face the terror of fire. Others launched sudden counterattacks from tunnel exits, charging into close combat in brief, violent bursts before retreating or dying in place. Combat at this stage became intensely personal. Engagements took place at arm's length, often in darkness. Grenades were thrown blindly around corners. Bayonets were used more frequently than rifles. Japanese soldiers relied on intimate knowledge of the tunnel layout to ambush advancing Marines, striking and disappearing before overwhelming firepower could be brought to bear. These actions inflicted casualties, but they also hastened the depletion of the defenders. Every attack consumed irreplaceable ammunition and lives that could not be replenished. Psychologically, the isolation was devastating. Communication with neighboring units broke down as tunnels collapsed and runners failed to return. Many soldiers had no idea how much of the island remained under Japanese control or whether any organized resistance still existed elsewhere. Orders were no longer received. Only the original intent remained. Fight where you stand. Delay the enemy. Do not surrender. In this vacuum, individual resolve replaced command structure. Some soldiers continued fighting long after their positions were tactically irrelevant, driven by duty rather than hope. As days turned into weeks, the tunnels lost their strategic advantage. What had once allowed movement and concealment now trapped defenders in shrinking pockets of resistance. American forces methodically reduced the underground network, sealing sections permanently. Japanese soldiers listened as explosions echoed closer, knowing that each blast marked the end of another escape route. Many wrote final messages or carved names into tunnel walls. Others sat silently, conserving energy for the moment when the enemy inevitably arrived. From the Japanese perspective, this phase of the battle stripped away any remaining illusions. Iwo Jima was no longer a defensive operation. It was a process of attrition carried out underground, where survival depended on chance and endurance rather than tactics. Yet resistance continued. Even isolated, starving, and wounded soldiers remained in position, firing when targets appeared and waiting when none did. The concept of retreat no longer existed. Only persistence remained. By this stage, the island had become a sealed system. Every Japanese defender understood that the tunnels would eventually be destroyed or sealed. What they did not know was when. Each moment spent underground was lived in anticipation of fire, collapse, or sudden confrontation. This constant tension defined the Japanese experience of Iwo Jima more than any single engagement. The battle was no longer about holding ground. It was about enduring the inevitable for as long as possible. By early March 1945, organized Japanese defense on Iwo Jima had begun to fracture. The tunnel network still existed in parts, but it no longer functioned as a coherent system. Key junctions were sealed, command posts destroyed, and communication between units had largely ceased. For many Japanese soldiers, the battle was no longer directed by officers or coordinated plans. It was fought in isolation, guided only by the original orders issued before the invasion: delay the enemy, inflict casualties, and do not surrender. The island had become a series of disconnected pockets, each fighting its own final battle. Leadership at higher levels had effectively ended. Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who had shaped the defense with precision and restraint, was now unable to exert control across the shattered battlefield. Orders could not reach most units, and even when they did, execution was often impossible. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were gone. Many soldiers fought with improvised weapons or scavenged equipment from the dead. Despite this, resistance continued. Japanese defenders launched small, desperate counterattacks at night, emerging from hidden positions to strike American lines before disappearing again. These actions had little strategic value, but they reflected a refusal to simply wait for death underground. The breakdown of structure forced individual soldiers to make choices within rigid constraints. Some chose to remain hidden, conserving strength until discovery was unavoidable. Others attacked immediately, preferring death in combat to suffocation or starvation. Groups that found themselves cut off from tunnels fought from caves or shell holes, adapting positions meant for temporary shelter into last stands. The distinction between frontline and rear vanished. Every location was contested, every movement risky. From the Japanese perspective, the island no longer felt like terrain to be defended. It felt like a shrinking enclosure. American forces pressed relentlessly, applying lessons learned earlier in the battle. Flamethrowers, demolition teams, and close infantry coordination systematically reduced remaining positions. Japanese soldiers observed that resistance no longer slowed the enemy in meaningful ways. What it did accomplish was delay, measured in hours rather than days. Yet even this delay mattered. Many defenders believed that every additional moment bought time for the homeland, even if the effect was symbolic. That belief sustained resistance long after military logic suggested it was futile. Psychological strain intensified as isolation deepened. Soldiers who had once fought alongside comrades now found themselves alone in darkness, listening for footsteps or voices above. Some lost track of time entirely. Others spoke to fallen comrades or recited prayers quietly in the tunnels. Death came unpredictably. A sudden explosion, a burst of fire, or collapse of the earth itself. Those who survived such moments often emerged disoriented, burned, or half-buried, only to continue fighting because stopping was not an option they recognized. By mid-March, the idea of holding Iwo Jima had ceased to exist. What remained was resistance without expectation. Japanese soldiers were no longer defending objectives or delaying advances in a coordinated sense. They were fulfilling an obligation defined months earlier, one that demanded persistence rather than success. This distinction mattered deeply. To surrender would negate the purpose of their endurance. To continue fighting, even in isolation, preserved it. The final days of the battle were marked by silence as much as violence. Fewer shots were fired, not because resistance had ended, but because there were fewer defenders left to fire them. Those who remained conserved ammunition for moments of certainty. Some waited in sealed tunnels until they suffocated. Others charged American positions in brief, final attacks that ended almost immediately. These actions were not attempts to change the outcome. They were expressions of resolve in a battle whose end was already decided. For the Japanese defenders, the collapse of organized defense did not mean the end of resistance. It marked the transition from collective struggle to individual endurance. Each soldier fought alone, bound by duty rather than command, continuing the battle until there was nothing left with which to fight. The experience of Iwo Jima in these final phases was not one of strategy or heroism, but of isolation, exhaustion, and inevitability. When organized resistance on Iwo Jima finally ended, the battle did not conclude cleanly or clearly. For many Japanese soldiers, there was no single moment that marked defeat. Fighting continued in fragments long after the island was officially declared secure by American forces. Isolated defenders remained hidden in caves and sealed tunnels, emerging sporadically to attack patrols or scavenge for food and water. Some did not realize the battle was over. Others knew but continued anyway, bound by orders that had never been revoked and a sense of duty that did not recognize surrender as an option. These final holdouts lived in extreme conditions. Starvation became the dominant enemy. Water was almost non-existent. Wounds went untreated. Many soldiers were too weak to stand, let alone fight. Yet even in this state, resistance persisted. A handful of Japanese soldiers were captured weeks after the battle ended, often after collapsing from exhaustion rather than being subdued in combat. Others died alone underground, their presence only discovered months or years later. Their continued resistance was not tactically meaningful, but it reflected the psychological reality of the battle. For those who survived the main fighting, Iwo Jima did not end with defeat. It ended with disappearance. From the Japanese perspective, the meaning of Iwo Jima was never victory. The island was sacrificed deliberately. The defense was intended to impose maximum cost on the enemy and delay further attacks on the Japanese mainland. In that limited sense, the objective was achieved. American casualties were far higher than expected, and the battle left a lasting impression on U.S. military planners and the public. Japanese soldiers understood this, even as they faced annihilation. Many believed their deaths had served a purpose, however small, within a larger national struggle that no longer promised survival. After the war, Iwo Jima occupied a complicated place in Japanese memory. It was not celebrated in the way earlier victories had been, nor was it openly condemned. Instead, it became a symbol of endurance under impossible conditions. Survivors rarely spoke of heroism. They spoke of hunger, darkness, and fear. They remembered comrades buried alive, tunnels filled with smoke, and the constant awareness that escape did not exist. The battle was recalled not as a moment of glory, but as an experience that tested the limits of human endurance. The legacy of Iwo Jima for Japanese forces lies in this distinction. It was a battle defined not by movement or maneuver, but by persistence in place. It demonstrated how far preparation, discipline, and sacrifice could be pushed when retreat and surrender were removed as options. At the same time, it revealed the cost of such a doctrine. Nearly the entire garrison was destroyed. The island was lost. The delay achieved came at the price of almost total annihilation. For the men who fought there, Iwo Jima was not an island on a map or a chapter in a campaign. It was an underground world of tunnels, dust, and silence, where survival was temporary and death inevitable. Their experience was shaped less by ideology than by conditions imposed upon them, conditions that demanded endurance rather than hope. In that sense, the Japanese experience of Iwo Jima stands apart from many other battles of the war. The battle ended, but its meaning did not. For Japanese forces, Iwo Jima became a reminder of what it meant to fight without expectation of survival, and of the human cost of a strategy built on sacrifice. It remains one of the clearest examples of how war, when stripped of movement and choice, becomes a test not of victory, but of endurance until nothing remains.